All right, for more, we are joined by Aurel Braun. He's a professor of international relations and political science at University of Toronto. Professor, were you surprised by how abruptly Wagner's rebellion ended? And what did you make of the fact that Putin cut a deal with a man that he called a traitor?
There are always surprises in a dictatorship because there is an inherent unpredictability. These are not transparent regimes, and they operate, especially in the case of Russia, which is so corrupt, they operate on a different kind of level than even normal dictatorships. But this was indeed abrupt. It appears that both Putin and Prigozhin had miscalculated. Perhaps Prigozhin had expected that we'd get support from various elements within the Russian military, obviously not the leadership, which he had condemned. But other people in the military, he did not get that actively, though it's quite remarkable that his forces were able to take over the southern military district in the city of Rostov-on-Don, where the Russian military was passive. They just allowed them to come in and seize the headquarters, and they were moving slowly towards Moscow. In the case of Vladimir Putin, there was a sea change within something like 7 hours, where he leveled the harshest accusations of betrayal, of stabbing in the back, or treason against the Wagner group and indirectly, of course, Prigozhin. And then come the news that there would be no charges, that they could leave, that there would be this kind of compromise. And in this kind of rule that Putin had, this personalist rule, this is definitely a sign of weakness. So I think at the end of the day, both Vladimir Putin and Prigozhin lost a good deal.
And how has this attempted mutiny then affected Putin's grip on power? And help us understand sort of the intra-elite conflict within Russia.
There are different kind of factions in Russia. There's the military, the security services, the Siloviki. Then there is the National Guard, which basically has as its primary role to safeguard Putin. And so we don't know how well they interact, because what Putin has done is to try to pit one faction against another. And he would be the ultimate arbiter and decider, and he would be unchallenged, he would be invincible, he would be invulnerable. This kind of rule depends on this aura of invulnerability. That has been punctured right now. He was forced to compromise. Now, we still don't know what internal debate there would have been that would have led Vladimir Putin to this kind of uncharacteristic compromise, for which he undoubtedly, in the longer term, is bound to pay a price. And so we will have to watch in the days and weeks to come what happens within the ruling elites inside Russia. We will have to see what happens to Prigozhin, who is supposed to go into exile into Belarus, but Belarus is controlled by an ally of Vladimir Putin's, and I do not think it would be a particularly safe place for exile for Prigozhin, or whether Prigozhin will somehow make his way to other assets of the Wagner Group. Let's not forget that the Wagner Group has been acting in Central African Republic, in Mali and elsewhere, where they generated not just a great deal of suffering, but also a great deal of wealth for themselves. So there are so many pieces here, and it's a kind of three-dimensional chess.
Indeed, Professor. So what do you think, what kind of lessons could Mr. Putin have learned from the incident?
He needs to learn some lessons from this, but I'm not convinced that he will learn those lessons, because that is not his character, and that is not the nature of his rule. The lesson that he ought to learn is that to run a country properly, you need to engage in the art of political compromise. But he cannot be an absolute leader and compromise at the same time. So more than likely, he would try to reinforce his rule. He would try to clamp down on any other possible dissent. He will shift the blame. He will try to find scapegoats. And this may well cause more tension. And so I think we may be in eventually for considerable turmoil. And it would not be entirely surprising if there would be at some point a change in leadership. At the moment, Mr. Putin has still prevailed. The three elements, the security services, the military, and the National Guard, appear to stand with him. And I think that was important. Well, we don't know if this will continue. And we also need to watch what happens to the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group has something like 25,000 soldiers, mercenaries inside Russia. Some of them are former Russian officers and soldiers who came from elite units. These units have been widely admired. Prigozhin himself had been widely praised for many months. You will note that when Prigozhin and his forces left Rostov-on-Don, the public came out in some significant numbers to cheer them. So they do have some level of support, and we will have to see how there will be this kind of interplay as the military tries to integrate the Wagner Group and tries to push them to sign contracts, which Prigozhin did not want to do.
Professor, how will other countries that have been sort of neutral or even supportive of Russia view these developments, China specifically?
I think this is where it's really, really important for allies or countries that have engaged in a very major way with Russia to look carefully at the risk that is involved here. This regime is much more unstable than it looks. Vladimir Putin is much less of a reliable ally than he seems to be. Any assumption that these countries may have made that they can count on a long-term stable relationship ought to be very carefully examined. Certainly, even large companies that wish to invest in Russia, and Western companies aren't, but there may be Chinese companies, the Indian companies, and others ought to really think about the political long-term implications of this challenge, because even though this was quelched within a very short time, it demonstrated a fundamental weakness on the part of Vladimir Putin. In that kind of rule, it's almost like an organized crime syndicate. You can look at the Godfather films or the Soprano television programs. The top leader never shows any weakness. He never lets any challenger survive. And yet, here we have this compromise solution just hours after Vladimir Putin personally leveled the harshest attack at the Wagner Group and promised that there would be measures taken to punish them.
Professor, we've got a minute left on the clock. But there are worries that Mr. Putin will feel pressure to ramp up military attacks in Ukraine to project power. What's your read into how the latest rebellion will affect the war in Ukraine? I mean, should Ukraine use this to their advantage?
It is not absolutely clear what exactly the Russians will do, but they may indeed try to ramp up military pressure to demonstrate that they are capable and that they were not weakened by this mutiny. But they don't really have the power to do that on a very large scale. We see that they have been on the defensive and morale is not particularly high. And this crisis cannot help but damage that morale. And this provides some opportunities for Ukraine. The problem has been that the momentum that Ukraine had back in September last year, that momentum was lost in some ways because the West did not promptly enough supply the necessary military equipment for an offensive. They have done that now, but the Russians have managed to build very elaborate defenses. So the Ukrainians do have a very tough task, but they seem to be persistent and they will keep pushing.
Professor, thank you very much for your insight and expertise this morning. We do appreciate your time. Aurel Braun there, Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Toronto.